A pale hush lay over the Imperial outpost like a shroud of frost. Once the relay station at the rim of the veiled halo crackled with the chatter of distant voices, astropathic signals from the heart of the Imperium, faint yet reassuring. Now only a low static trembled through the vox, the echoes of a choir that had fallen wordless. It was as though the stars themselves had grown wary of speech. Lieutenant Arlen Cord stood at the observation deck, visor dimmed against the distant glare of a dead sun. Below him the planet rolled in slow rotation, its surface a bleak sweep of ash and ice. The station's shields whispered as cosmic dust struck and dissolved. Every sound carried too clearly, the hiss of air recyclers, the occasional tick of contracting metal. They had all begun to measure time not by the clocks, but by the intervals of silence between these small, mechanical sighs. In the communications sanctum, astropath Vera knelt before the psychic array. Her eyes, milky from birth, flicked beneath closed lids. Threads of incense smoke coiled about her in languid spirals, yet the familiar chorus of the Empyrean eluded her grasp. Where once the warp thrummed like a vast ocean, tonight it lay still, a fathomless black. Her mind reached outward and met nothing of a void where whispers should have lived. She drew back as if scalded, heart skittering in the cage of her chest. Cord entered quietly. The pale green of the sanctum's lumen strips carved the hard angles of his face. "Any word?" he asked, voice soft enough to honor the hush. Vera shook her head. It is not mere distance. Something moves in the silence. Something. Listening, he did not ask what she meant. The unspoken had already settled between every crewman. Rumors passed in restrained murmurs, a fleet lost beyond the halo, a black ship glimpsed and then gone. Even the most faithful began their prayers with hesitant tongues. The Emperor's light felt thin here, stretched to a thread at the edge of creation. Hours drifted like dust. Patrol beacons winked in endless repetition across the void, their signals answered only by the station's own reflection. The void beyond remained vast and patient. Beneath the slow-turning stars, the outpost seemed no more than a lone candle in an infinite night. When the change finally came, it was too slight to name a breath of static that hissed through the vox like a warning drawn between teeth. Vera lifted her head sharply. In the darkness behind her blind eyes, a single syllable quivered, half-heard and unclaimed, like the echo of a dream. She could not tell if it came from the warp or from something older, something deeper. Cord felt it too. A subtle weight pressing against the hull, a presence without form. He looked once through the viewport at the endless scatter of stars. Their cold light revealed nothing, yet the silence seemed to lean closer, listening for the next heartbeat. Lieutenant Arlen Cord had long believed he could read the silence of the void. Years spent in patrol fleets and listening posts had trained him to sense the difference between calm and quiet, between stillness and the kind of pause that waits to be broken. Tonight, the hush over outpost Selenica felt like the latter, an expectant stillness that coiled behind every routine sound. He leaned against the cold alloy of the corridor bulkhead, helmet tucked beneath one arm, and listened. The distant hum of the reactor room wavered like a note held too long. Air vents exhaled their dry, recycled breath. Even the footfalls of the night watch carried a brittle edge, as if the metal floors themselves were tense. He told himself it was only the long weeks without relief, the isolation at the edge of Imperial reach. But the thought failed to settle. In his quarters, the glow of a single lumen strip bled across a narrow desk strewn with star charts. He tried to lose himself in their neat coordinates, tracing patrol routes with a stylus, but the thin lines only reminded him of how far Selenica lay from the nearest bastion of the Imperium. Every path home stretched across uncountable light-years of cold. For the first time in years, he found himself whispering the Emperor's name before sleep, not from habit, but from the faintest tremor of fear. When the chime of his door announced a visitor, he started. Astropath Vera entered with the slow grace of one who always listened inward. The scent of incense clung to her robes. Her unseeing eyes reflected the strip light like pale moons. "You feel it too?" she said without greeting. Cord set down his stylus. "The silence?" She inclined her head. Not the absence of voices, the presence within the absence. Something to watch. Her fingers tightened on the staff she carried, knuckles whitening. Cord searched her face, wishing for any sign of ordinary worry. He found none, only a calm that made the hair on his neck rise. "Could be the relays failing," he offered, though the words felt thin. "If it were only that," Vera murmured, "my mind would be my own tonight." Her words lingered after she departed. Cord sat long in the dim light, the distant heartbeat of the reactor echoing through the walls. Beyond the station's steel skin lay the endless dark, indifferent and immense. Yet as he listened, he could not shake the sense that something out there listened back, waiting, patient, and unseen. Out beyond the halo of familiar stars, the void began to tremble with forces no Imperial chart had mapped. It started as a whisper of tiny deviations in the gravitic readings that Lieutenant Arlen Cord reviewed each dawn cycle. At first, he blamed the station's aging sensors, a flicker of static, a misaligned array. Yet the pattern deepened, steady and deliberate, until the anomaly could no longer be dismissed as error. Space itself seemed to breathe in uneven tides. Patrol probes reported slight drifts from their designated orbits. The delicate dance of asteroids in the neighboring belt grew erratic, as though an unseen tide had tugged at their ancient paths. Even the outpost's artificial gravity betrayed a faint, unaccountable sway, a heartbeat out of sync with its own machinery. Crewmen exchanged uneasy glances when cups slid almost imperceptibly across mess tables. The engineers stripped and recalibrated every stabilizer, yet the subtle lurch continued, quiet and insistent. Then came the dying signals. At first it was a minor relay station 3 light-years away. Its routine beacon faded mid-cycle, leaving a half-finished code trembling in the ether. Another station followed, and another, each one falling silent like candles snuffed by an unseen wind. Cord sat hunched over the Vox arrays, listening to the last static breaths of distant comrades. Their final transmissions were not pleas or alarms, but abrupt, unfinished words that ended in a soft hiss, as if a hand had gently closed upon the throat of the void. Astropath Vera felt it long before the data confirmed it. She woke from trance with her blind eyes wide, a thin sheen of sweat on her brow. "The warp recoils," she whispered to no one in particular. "Something vast moves, and even the immaterium will not speak its name." Her voice carried the tremor of one who had heard the echo of a predator, too large to comprehend. Cord gathered his officers in the command gallery, their faces pale in the cold glow of the star charts. Dying lights marked the positions of the lost stations like a constellation of extinguished hopes. He traced the pattern with a gloved finger, feeling the slow pull of dread tighten around his chest. The silence was spreading in a deliberate arc, closing like a net. No order from the Imperium came. No reinforcements burned through the void. Only the gentle creak of the station's hull and the distant wail of metal under strain broke the quiet. Far beyond sight, in depths where starlight itself grew thin, something vast and patient reached across the dark, drawing nearer with every breath. And hungrier than any mind dared imagine. The night sky above outpost Selenica began to change in ways that even the untrained eye could not mistake. Lieutenant Arlen Cord first noticed it during his routine watch from the observation deck, where the stars usually shone like a frozen spray of diamonds. Tonight their light wavered, not dimmed by cloud or dust. There were no such comforts this far from any living world, but veiled by something that moved with a patient purpose. At first, it seemed like a trick of fatigue. Cord rubbed the heel of his hand across tired eyes and recalibrated the deck's long-range augers. The readouts were clean. No asteroid field or drifting debris lay in that sector. Yet when he looked back, a cluster of pinpoints along the western fringe of the veiled halo had faded as though an unseen hand pressed a shadow across them. One star blinked out, then another. The effect was not sudden but gradual, like a tide rising in darkness. Below, the outpost's hull shivered with a subtle vibration that had nothing to do with engines or orbital drift. It thrummed through the plating beneath Cord's boots. A low resonance felt more than heard. He keyed the comm and requested a diagnostic sweep. The reply came crisp and empty, all systems stable. He stood motionless, watching the pattern of disappearing light stretch across the black, and a chill settled behind his ribs. Astropath Vera joined him without a word. The door's hiss barely marked her entrance. Her presence carried the hush of a chapel. Blind eyes lifted toward the viewport, as if she could see the same encroaching void. The soft incense of her robes clung to the cold air. "You feel it?" Cord asked, voice roughened by a tension he would not name. Vera tilted her head, the faintest tremor at her mouth. "It is not sight that warns me," she said quietly. "The warp has drawn its breath and holds it. Something vast moves between the stars, and even the immaterium dares no song." Cord turned back to the sky. The darkness now formed immense, curving silhouettes that devoured the constellations behind them. Their edges were neither mechanical nor natural. No straight line, no crystalline arc, only organic vastness, as if titanic creatures drifted across the heavens. The station's sensors struggled to capture their outlines, returning only fractured echoes and false readings. Each attempt to map them left the display flickering with static, as though the instruments themselves recoiled. The crew gathered along the observation decks in uneasy silence. Engineers, gunners, even the off-duty cooks are all drawn by the slow extinguishing of their familiar sky. Faces turned upward, washed in the pallid glow of emergency lumens. No one spoke. The usual murmur of the outpost died, replaced by the quiet heartbeat of metal under strain and the soft rasp of collective breath. A ripple of motion passed through the shadow like a muscle beneath skin. The stars it had swallowed did not return. Instead, a deeper blackness settled, so complete it seemed to swallow even thought. Cord felt the weight of it pressing against the viewport, a presence both alien and deliberate. In that moment, the void no longer felt empty, but occupied by something so immense that the station itself seemed like an insect clinging to glass. Vera's voice came at last, barely above a whisper. "They have arrived," Cord's throat tightened. He knew nothing of what "they" meant, yet the certainty in her tone left no room for question. Around them the vast shadows drifted onward, patient and inexorable, eclipsing the heavens one star at a time. Alarms blared through outpost Selenica like a sudden storm. Red lumen strips pulsed along the corridors, throwing frantic shadows across steel walls. Lieutenant Arlen Cord sprinted toward the command gallery, the echo of his boots drowned by the rising din of voices. The station, so long wrapped in uneasy quiet, now rang with the sharp edges of panic. Inside the gallery, senior officers clustered around the central hololith. Star charts flickered in agitated loops, their constellations smeared by static where the dark shapes moved. Captain Dyron's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "We cannot outrun this. Our orders are to hold." "Reinforcements will come." Commander Hallen slammed a fist against the railing. "Hold against what? We don't even know what we face." "Those things devour the stars." "We're a listening post, not a fortress." The tension snapped like a live wire. Junior officers exchanged frightened glances, their crisp uniforms undone by sweat and trembling hands. Cord felt the press of their fear, the weight of an enemy unseen yet immense. The hololith displayed only the slow creep of darkness, erasing known routes like ink spilled across parchment. Every second brought the unknown closer. "The Emperor tests us," Darin declared, eyes bright with a zeal that sounded brittle. "To flee is heresy. We stand as his light at the edge of the void." "And die blind," Hallen shot back. "Faith will not shield us from whatever waits in that dark." Astropath Vera stood near the gallery's threshold, silent until now. Her blind gaze lifted, and the room seemed to hush in spite of itself. "The warp is silent," she said. "No message can leave this place. No plea will reach the Imperium in time." The statement fell like a stone into a frozen lake. The officers' arguments faltered. Without the warp, there could be no astropathic call for aid, no warning to nearby systems. They were a single candle, flickering and unseen. Captain Darin's jaw tightened. "Then we fight," he said, each word bitten off. "If we cannot be heard, we will be remembered." Hallen turned away, his shoulders sagging. "Remembered by whom?" he muttered, but too softly for Darin to answer. Cord felt the air thicken with the unspoken choice to abandon their post and risk the unknown void, or remain and face a darkness that had already silenced worlds. Duty warred with survival, faith with the primal urge to live. Around him, the gallery's alarm subsided to a low, relentless pulse, like the beating of some vast and unseen heart. No order came. No plan satisfied both fear and honor. The officers stood in the dim red light, each staring into the hololith's shifting black, waiting for a decision that none truly wished to make. While beyond the station, the stars continued to vanish, one by one. The first sign of real danger was not the shadows blotting the stars, but the absence of ordinary comforts. Outpost Salonika had always lived on a knife edge of supply, ration shipments from distant worlds, water condensed from vapor, food grown in narrow hydroponic bays. When the relays fell silent, those lifelines frayed in a single night. In the lower habitation decks, families gathered around empty dispensers, their voices rising in sharp, tired arguments. The usual hum of machinery, a sound so constant it had once faded into the mind's background, now became a mocking reminder of scarcity. Every hiss of an air filter, every drip from a leaking pipe carried the question no one wanted to voice. How long before these, too, failed? A child cried near the hydroponics gates, his small fists pounding the sealed hatch. Inside, technicians worked by the dim glow of emergency lumens, coaxing the nutrient pumps to life with trembling hands. Green rows of algae and nutrient moss should have promised security. Instead, they drooped and yellowed. One by one, warning runes flared red along the consoles. The chief grower, an elderly woman named Marl, whispered a prayer to the Emperor before each adjustment, her voice cracking as if the words themselves might keep the crops alive. Further along the main corridor, workers queued at the water stations, cups and canisters clutched like relics. The dispenser's thin trickles sputtered to nothing before half the line was served. Frustration flared an elbow jab, a barked curse, then a scuffle that drew others like dry tinder to a spark. Two men grappled, their struggles sending cups clattering across the floor. A young woman pulled them apart, her own eyes wet with fear. No one apologized. Hunger and thirst left no room for courtesy. Astropath Vera moved among them like a silent wraith, her pale eyes fixed on some inner horizon. Some reached out to her robes, as though the Emperor's blessing might cling to her touch. She spoke with no comfort. The warp remained mute, and in its silence even faith began to fray. Children clung to their parents with blank stares, sensing dread they could not name. Lieutenant Cord walked the same corridors, the metallic tang of recycled air sharp in his throat. He saw not soldiers or civilians, but fragile lives balanced against an invisible pressure. The fear in their faces was more than simple need. It was the terror of being forgotten, of vanishing unheard at the edge of creation. He felt it too, a hollow ache that no order or weapon could fill. Above, the observation deck still watched the dark shapes drift closer, swallowing the sky. But down here, desperation already had a taste: dry lips, empty cups, and the brittle edge of voices about to break. The true horror was not death in the stars, but the slow unraveling of the living while they waited for it to arrive. The first warning was a sound that did not belong to any world of men. It began as a low tremor beneath the outpost's landing plates, a vibration that turned every steel beam into a tuning fork of unease. Lieutenant Arlen Cord felt it through the soles of his boots before he heard a subtle, pulsing resonance, like the distant beating of some colossal heart. The night sky above the frozen planet was a dome of black glass, stars still masked by those vast and shifting shadows. Then came the scrape. It slid across the silence like a blade across bone, chitin rasping against rock, a dry, relentless hiss. The sound multiplied, folding into itself until it became an insectile chorus. Walls carried the vibration, turning bulkheads into hollow throats. Crew who had endured weeks of grim waiting now clutched their weapons as if the noise itself could cut them. Outside, the horizon bled with a faint green luminescence, not the soft glow of aurora, but an oily light that pulsed in time with the tremors. Cord watched through the viewport as the snowfields below seemed to ripple, dark ridges rising where moments before there had been only ice. Shapes emerged at first vague, then horribly precise, limbs jointed at wrong angles, talons catching the moonlight, carapaces glistening like wet obsidian. Astropath Vera stood beside him, face pale in the dim emergency glow. Though her eyes saw nothing, her nostrils flared. A new scent had entered the air, sweet at first, like overripe fruit, then sour and metallic, a perfume of rot and hunger. It coated the back of the throat like oil, impossible to swallow away. Cord's stomach tightened. The smell was not merely carried on the wind. It seemed alive, seeping through the station's seals as if the air itself conspired to betray them. Around them the crew muttered prayers, each voice a brittle thread. A sudden impact shook the outpost. Snow and shards of ice leapt skyward as something immense struck the ground below. Another impact followed, then another, until the frozen plain writhed beneath a storm of descending bodies. Each creature landed with a sickening thud, chitin striking stone, talons digging deep. The sky briefly flashed with streaks of meteoric fire spores or pods, each one a living weapon. Through the viewport, Cord saw the first of the organisms lift its head. Its silhouette alone carried the weight of a nightmare, a crown of jagged horns, a mouth of scything mandibles that opened in a soundless roar. Behind it, countless smaller shapes swarmed like an ocean tide, their movements a perfect, mindless rhythm. Vera's voice trembled, though she barely breathed. The veil is torn. The void itself hungers. The scent thickened, an invisible tide of alien pheromones that clung to every surface. It whispered of consumption, of a feast that would not end. The chitinous scraping grew louder, filling every corridor, every hollow space within the outpost, until it seemed the entire station shivered beneath a single monstrous will. Cord gripped the railing, knuckles white. As the nightmarish descent continued, an endless rain of predators from a sky that had already forgotten the stars. The first salvo roared from Outpost Selenika's outer batteries in a storm of white-blue fire. Macro cannons hammered the frozen plains, their recoil rattling every bolt in the station's frame. For an instant the night blazed with the fury of men who refused to yield, incandescent streaks of las and the thunder of Earthshaker rounds, rolling like distant thunder across the void-cold air. Lieutenant Arlen Cord watched from the command gallery as the Imperial Guard formations advanced. From their trenches, lines of disciplined steel and flesh etched in the harsh glare of searchlights. They moved with machine-drilled precision, banners snapping like defiant tongues of flame against the darkness. Overhead, Valkyrie gunships cut low arcs through the sky, their engines howling. The first impacts struck home. Explosions blossomed across the plain, fighting fire and shattered ice. For a heartbeat it seemed the tide of black shapes had halted. Vox channels crackled with terse confirmations, a litany of firing solutions and kill counts. A cheer began to rise, then died, strangled by what emerged from the smoke. The alien tide came on unbroken. From the curtain of fire leapt creatures slick with ichor and flame, their chitinous hides glistening as if the Emperor's wrath were no more than rain. Living artillery beasts whose swollen thoraxes spat searing bioplasma answered the guard's barrage with a storm of molten death. Trenches erupted in showers of dirt and gore. Cord gripped the rail as the front rank staggered. Guardsmen fired until their barrels glowed, laser rifles spitting red lances that scorched but did not slow the advance. Heavy bolters barked in measured fury. Explosive shells ripped through the swarm, only for the gaps to close in seconds. Each alien that fell was devoured by the tide of its kin, replaced before the body hit the ground. Artillery crews resighted their Earthshakers, thundering shell after shell into the mass. The ground shook. Smoke thickened, yet the swarm surged nearer, an ocean of talons and scything limbs. A single monstrous form, taller than a battle tank, burst from the haze. Its carapace shimmered with a natural sheen of acid. The first volley of crack missiles burst harmlessly against it. With one sweep of its bladed arms, it ripped through an entire emplacement, men and metal alike, torn as though they were parchment. Panic bled through the Vox. Shouted orders tangled with screams. Cord heard the edge of desperation in every voice, officers calling for fallback positions that no longer existed, medical pleas drowned by static. The guards' proud formations buckled, their once straight lines curling inward like paper before a flame. From the sky came the screech of Valkyries diving for close support. Autocannons raked the ground in incandescent streams, carving temporary lanes through the tide. But for every alien crushed beneath the fusillade, two more crawled over the carcass of the first. A gunship banked too low. A winged horror leapt from the darkness and dragged it screaming from the air. Astropath Vera clutched her staff in the gallery's shadow, her sightless eyes reflecting the flicker of burning trenches. "It feeds," she whispered, unheard beneath the cacophony. Cord felt the deck tremble beneath his feet, the vibration no longer from their own guns, but from the pounding of countless alien limbs. Imperial firepower, doctrine, and courage, none of it slowed the swarm. The proud lines of the guard dissolved into scattered pockets of dying light, their resistance swallowed as surely as the stars had been. The first survivors stumbled through the half-lit corridors like wraiths, Their boots left streaks of blackened slush across the deck. Plates melted ice mixed with something thicker, something that clung like resin and smelled of meat, left too long in the sun. Lieutenant Arlen Cord met them at the inner bulkhead, his las pistol drawn, though he doubted it would matter. Their faces told the story before their voices could. Eyes wide, uniforms torn and spattered with ichor, they carried the silence of those who had seen the unthinkable. Behind them seeped a stench that defied words. It arrived on a damp, creeping draught, a fusion of rot and wet iron, of sweet fungal bloom and acrid chemical tang. The air tasted of copper, and something almost honeyed, as if decay itself had learned to seduce. Lord gagged, the smell coating his throat with a film that no breath could clear. The station's filters whined under the burden, and still the scent thickened. Astropath Vera shuddered as the first of the guard collapsed to his knees. "It breathes," she whispered, her sightless eyes narrowing as though the very air pressed against her skin. "The hive breathes through us." From the shattered entry lock came a slow, organic creak, like tendons stretching beneath stone. Shapes moved in the gloom beyond the threshold, and the smell deepened into something almost alive. A slick film of mucus glistened along the walls, pulsing faintly as though a heartbeat thrummed within the station itself. Where steel once gleamed, a creeping lattice of fleshy strands spread in wet spirals, each tendril tipped with barbed hooks that bit into metal. Cord steadied his weapon as the first bioform emerged. It crawled low, its segmented carapace slick with black ichor, every joint moving with insectile precision. Its limbs were scything blades of chitin, glistening with a viscous sheen. Where eyes might have been, clusters of sensory nodules pulsed with a dim bioluminescence, casting sickly green light across the corridor. Beneath its thorax, sacks of translucent flesh quivered, pumping some unknown fluid through a network of veined tubing. The sound of its breathing, wet, rhythmic, almost intimate, filled the air like the rasp of a predator savoring the hunt. Behind it, more forms unfolded from the shadows, serpentine creatures with mouths ringed in cilia, beetle-backed monstrosities bearing living cannons fused to their spines. They moved with the unity of a single thought, their motions too perfectly synchronized to be mere instinct. Each step brought the stench sharper, the pheromonal musk of a predator hive, chemical commands and promises of feeding. It was a scent of purpose, of a hunger that had no limit. One of the wounded guardsmen whimpered, the sound slicing through the heavy air. The nearest creature turned its noduled head with a fluid grace, as if the noise had been a summons. Cord saw mandibles flex, a bead of drool hiss where it struck the deck. He tightened his grip on the pistol, though he knew the gesture was a prayer more than a threat. The corridor seemed to pulse with them now, a living artery in some colossal organism. Steel groaned under the slow encroachment of alien tissue. The station itself was being rewritten, consumed into the architecture of the hive. The survivors drew back, the air thick with the perfume of their own terror, and the ripe, unending smell of the swarm, a scent that promised not merely death, but absorption into something vaster and eternally hungry. Above the dying world, the heavens began to move. At first, it seemed like another layer of night, a deepening of the dark that no star could pierce. But as the hours dragged toward false dawn, the veil thickened, and the blackness took on weight. Lieutenant Arlen Cord stood on the shattered observation deck, visor raised, and felt the air grow damp against his skin. A haze of fine motes drifted across the cracked viewport spores, so small they caught the emergency lumens and shimmered like ghostly dust. Each breath tasted faintly of iron and something sweetly rancid, a flavor that clung to the back of the tongue like rot wrapped in honey. The sky rippled. It began with a slow undulation, a tide of shadow that rolled from horizon to horizon until the planet's firmament seemed to flex. Stars that had survived the first nights of terror blurred and vanished behind a membrane of shifting grey. The motion was not the restless churn of clouds, but the measured contraction of something vast and alive. It stretched across the upper atmosphere like the belly of some slumbering beast. A distant rumble followed a bass note so low it shivered through the bones rather than the ears. The ground quaked in sympathy. Frost on the observation rail cracked in a fine white line, as if the world itself braced for the weight above. Cord gripped the rail and stared upward, his pulse matching the slow, ponderous rhythm that now throbbed through the air. Shapes emerged from the roiling canopy. First came the living towers, gargantuan spires of chitin and pulsating flesh, descending like the roots of a nightmare. They glistened with wet membranes that reflected the planet's wan light, and each subtle movement shed a rain of glistening spores. These were no simple vessels, but organism cities of living tissue that breathed and fed. Their surfaces writhed with endless detail, ribbed conduits pulsing with some internal ichor, vast plates of bone flexing with every unseen heartbeat. Around them swam smaller shapes, if smaller, could name such leviathans. Bioships shaped like colossal kraken, unfurled tendrils tipped with luminous sacs, their movements eerily graceful in the heavy sky. Some shed torrents of seed pods that streaked toward the surface like meteor showers, each impact sending a muffled tremor through the soil. Others hovered, exhaling clouds of spores that rolled down like mist, turning the air into a living fog. The planet's own winds no longer belonged to themselves. They carried the musky perfume of alien life, damp, resinous, faintly metallic. Every breath was a reminder that the sky had become a lung and the world an unwitting host. Astropath Vera stepped beside Cord, her sightless eyes lifted to the pulsating firmament. "The veil has quickened," she whispered, her voice nearly lost beneath the low, continuous drone. "The sky is no longer ours," Lord could not answer. Above them, the heavens swelled with an awful vitality. It was as though the void itself had put on flesh, and the world, his world, now lay beneath the breathing skin of a hunger older than stars. Within the vast hulls of the Hive Fleet, life itself had been sculpted into machinery. Each vessel, if the word still held meaning, was a living colossus, an organism the size of a continent whose every cell carried purpose. To imperial augurs the ships read like shifting constellations of flesh and bone, their signatures confounding the logic of metal and void. But inside, the truth was stranger still. The outer carapace of a Tyranid bioship formed a labyrinth of armored plates grown from layered chitin and calcified muscle. Beneath that living armor lay a skin of translucent membranes, slick with nutrient ichor that pulsed to the rhythm of a colossal heart. Each beat drove tides of oxygenated fluids through arteries wider than city avenues, their walls glowing faintly with bioluminescent veins. The air was humid and thick, alive with the scent of resin and the faint metallic tang of blood that never dried. Passageways curved like the bowels of some primeval leviathan. Their floors flexed, with each tremor of the creature's movement, a slow peristaltic rhythm that carried spores and half-formed organisms toward their destined chambers. Digestive vents exhaled warm mist, laced with acidic fumes. Droplets hissed as they struck the pulsing walls. Every surface seemed aware that membranes quivered when touched, and clusters of sensory nodules tracked the faintest vibration. Like a million blind eyes, at the ship's core sprawled the gestation pits, immense caverns where new life boiled. Here, pools of nutrient sludge frothed with embryonic shapes, coiled serpentine feeders, embryonic winged hunters, larvae encased in translucent sacs that twitched with half-formed limbs. Overhead, ligament-like conduits dripped steady streams of enzymatic fluid to feed the ever-hungry brood. The sound was a constant, wet susurrus, the sigh of tissue knitting itself into weapons. Near these pits lay the digestion chambers, where the harvest of conquered worlds was reduced to slurry. Vast, gullet-like tunnels funneled matter inward, stone and soil, bone and steel, all crushed and dissolved by waves of living acid. Enzymatic tides churned with fragments of what had once been cities, the remains of machines and monuments broken down to their simplest elements. Nothing endured. Even the memory of what had been devoured was lost in the churning broth. Guiding it all was the synaptic nexus, a living brain of layered nerve clusters and pulsating ganglia. Here, the will of the hive mind burned brightest, a collective intelligence without face or mercy. Electric impulses flickered across vast neural strands, each spark a command that rippled through the entire fleet. The bioship did not merely transport the swarm, it thought, planned, hungered. To the Imperium these were abominations beyond reckoning, yet within their own design lay a terrifying elegance. Every organ, every droplet of fluid served the singular purpose of consumption. These worlds within beasts were not merely alive, they were hunger incarnate, a living ecosystem built to strip creation to the bone and move on, leaving nothing but silence where once there had been stars. The first vessels to break orbit did so in silence. No hero's farewell, no final salute, only the desperate flicker of engines igniting against a sky already crawling with alien life. Freighters, patrol cutters, even battered shuttles rose from the battered launch bays of outpost Selenica, their drives burning bright against the thick, spore-choked air. They climbed like sparks from a dying fire, each one carrying families, wounded soldiers, fragments of a world that still dreamed of survival. For a breath, it seemed possible. The upper atmosphere lay heavy with the haze of the hive, but the fleeing craft pierced it with stubborn streaks of light, vox channels filled with clipped prayers and half-choked orders. Children sobbed in the background of strained transmissions, and pilots pushed their engines past safety limits, seeking the cold freedom beyond the planet's grasp. Then the swarm moved. From the living canopy above, vast shadows, uncoiled creatures shaped like nightmares of the deep void. Bioships drifted forward with the slow grace of predators who knew there was nowhere to run. Their chitinous flanks rippled with phosphorescent veins, and from their cavernous maws poured clouds of needle-like spores. These motes glittered like dust in starlight, beautiful and deadly. Where they touched the fleeing ship's void shields, energy flared and sputtered like wet kindling. A frigate banked hard, its captain daring a blind jump toward the system's edge. A sinuous tendril of living flesh lashed out from the nearest hive ship, a whip of muscle hundreds of meters long. It coiled around the frigate's hull before the crew could react. Metal screamed as the tendril constricted, cracking adamantium like dry bark. The ship's thrusters flared once, then died, engines smothered by a sudden flood of organic resin. In moments, the vessel was drawn into the creature's gaping orifice, a mouth of glistening plates that closed with obscene finality. Smaller craft fared no better. Spore mines, each a living bomb, drifted in patient arcs and detonated in blossoms of acid when a shuttle strayed too near. Escape pods, desperate and unarmed, found themselves ensnared by swarms of winged organisms that clung to their hulls like leeches. Through the vox came brief, ragged screams that ended in wet static. No distress beacon reached beyond the living curtain of the fleet. Even the warp lay mute, as if the universe itself had turned away. Lieutenant Arlen Cord watched from the shattered observation deck, knuckles bloodless around the railing. Around him, civilians and soldiers alike stood transfixed, faces pale in the sickly light of the spore-clouded sky. Every human impulse to fight, to flee, to prey seemed suddenly small. Above them, the hive ships moved with unhurried certainty, their immense bodies flexing in a rhythm older than stars. They did not chase. They simply fed, and all that lived within their reach was already theirs. Astropath Vera's voice broke the silence, scarcely more than breath. "There is no distance," she murmured. "No escape, only the feast." Her words lingered like the metallic tang of blood in the air. One by one, the last sparks of fleeing light winked out, swallowed whole. The void beyond offered no refuge, only the endless patient hunger of the swarm, a hunger that would not stop until every trace of life, every memory of resistance, had been consumed. Seas that had glittered like shards of frozen glass now churned with a color no ocean was meant to wear. From the fractured cliffs of outpost Selenika's observation ridge, Lieutenant Arlen Cord watched the waters below collapse into a sluggish swirl of dark, translucent gel. Waves no longer broke. They sagged and oozed like the skin of some great wound. The air above the shore hung heavy with a briny sweetness that turned the stomach a perfume of decay mixed with something almost floral, as though the planet itself exhaled its dying breath. Great towers of alien tissue had descended during the night, their roots burrowing through rock and seabed with the patience of hunger. From their swollen bases poured rivers of milky secretion, a living solvent that spread across the tides in slow, concentric ripples. Wherever it touched, the ocean thickened. Foam curdled into greasy clots. Fish floated belly up, their scales dulled and peeling. Even the salt lost its sharp bite, absorbed into the gelatinous mass until the very concept of water seemed to unravel. The sound of the sea changed first. Gone was the familiar crash of surf against stone. In its place came a wet, fibrous slurp, the noise of countless microscopic feeders stripping molecules from every drop. Cord felt the vibration through the rocks beneath his boots, a steady, patient rhythm like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature drinking the world dry. Mist rose from the gelled surface in gauzy curtains, carrying a coppery tang that stung the eyes and left a bitter taste on the tongue. Astropath Vera stood beside him, her sightless face turned toward the unseen horizon. "It is feeding," she whispered, voice barely audible over the low, ceaseless murmur. "The oceans are its blood now." Far across the bay, where once a city's lights had danced on the waves, the Tyranid capillary towers flexed and pulsed. Their chitinous walls throbbed with veins of bioluminescent ichor, pumping the harvested slurry upward into the waiting void. From their crowns, clouds of spores vented in slow, deliberate breaths, each exhalation a promise that the feast would continue until nothing remained. Cord watched a lone seabird wheel across the dying sky, wings beating frantically above the thickening mire. It dipped low, perhaps seeking a last scrap of fish or the comfort of familiar waters. The air caught it mid-flight, a drifting sheet of invisible pheromones that clung like oil. The bird faltered, spiraled once, and dropped soundlessly into the gelatinous sea. There was no splash, only a faint ripple as the surface absorbed it whole. Night crept over the horizon, but darkness brought no relief. The ocean itself glowed faintly from within, a dim green radiance pulsing in time with the tower's heartbeat. The planet's great waters, once a shield of life, had become a single vast organ in the body of the swarm. Cord felt the weight of it pressing into his chest, the undeniable truth that the world beneath his feet was no longer his own. The Tyranids were not merely killing the planet, they were rewriting it, turning every drop of ocean into food, every breath of air into the scent of an unending hunger. The survivors chose the ruined bastion not because it could hold, but because it still stood once munitions were kept. Its walls were now scorched and pitted by weeks of bombardment. Chunks of ferrocrete jutted like broken teeth against the green-lit sky. Lieutenant Arlen Cord led the final band through the shattered archway at dusk, the air behind them already thick with the drone of approaching wings. Every step left prints in the damp, copper-scented dust, the residue of oceans turned to gel. They were soldiers, labourers, children, and the last ragged echo of a colony. Some carried last rifles scavenged from the dead, others gripped simple tools sharpened into makeshift spears. Their faces bore the hollow look of those who had measured the odds and found only a brief postponement of the inevitable. Yet they moved with purpose. It was not hope that drove them, but the need to decide the manner of their end. Cord climbed the inner rampart and scanned the horizon. The sky above pulsed with the bioluminescent haze of the Hive Fleet, its living ships veiled in clouds of drifting spores. From that rippling darkness poured the sound of countless beating wings, dull, relentless, like the surge of an unseen tide. He tightened his grip on his lapistol and felt the cold settle into his bones. Astropath Vera stood beside him, the staff in her hands trembling ever so slightly. Though her blind eyes held no light, her face turned toward the gathering swarm, as if she could see the predators approach.
"They will not remember us," she said softly.
"But we can remember each other." Below, the survivors worked in silence. Ammunition was stacked in careful piles. A boy, no older than 12, dragged a broken autocannon into position with the stubborn strength of desperation. An elderly woman traced the sign of the Aquila across her brow, and then, without a word, offered the same blessing to the boy. He accepted with a solemn nod, his small hands already blackened with oil. The first wave descended with a screech of chitin and a rush of hot, spore-thick air. Winged forms dived from the green-lit sky, their talons catching the dying sun. Lasfire cracked in ragged bursts. The broken bastion blazed with muzzle flashes, each bolt of light swallowed almost at once by the endless dark of the swarm. Creatures fell, some burned by las bolts, others torn apart by the autocannon's belching roar, but for each that died, 3 more climbed over the twitching remains. Their bodies struck the walls in a rain of talons and acid, the air filling with the reek of alien ichor. Stone hissed and smoked where their fluids touched, yet the defenders held their line. Cord fired until his pistol's charge pack bled dry, then drew his combat blade. Around him, men and women fought with a fury beyond fear, their voices rising not in panic, but in defiance, prayers, curses, a single, wordless roar that belonged to all of them. The swarm surged unstoppable. One by one the defenders fell, swallowed by a tide that knew neither mercy nor malice. Yet, in those final moments, the bastion rang with the sound of human courage, bright and unyielding against the impersonal hunger that sought to erase it. For as long as their voices carried, they proved that humanity could choose the manner of its end, and that even in the shadow of the hive, dignity could outlast hope. The last screams dwindled like embers in a wind that no longer stirred. When the final gunshot cracked across the ruined bastion, it seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, a single sharp note swallowed by an infinite hush. Lieutenant Arlen Cord lowered his empty las pistol and listened. No answering cry came from the darkness beyond the walls.
No wing beat, no scuttling scrape of chitin.
only the slow drip of acid rain through the shattered battlements and the faint hiss of cooling metal. The Vox arrays, once alive with frantic calls and desperate coordinates, had fallen mute hours earlier. At first, the static had carried fragments of voices, half a prayer, a child's sob, the clipped code of soldiers dying at their posts. One by one, those fragments had guttered out, leaving only a low, soft crackle. Now even that thin ghost of sound was gone. The instruments glowed a dim and meaningless green, waiting for signals that would never return. Astropath Vera knelt beside the scorched remains of her staff. Her sightless eyes stared into nothing, yet her face betrayed no surprise. "The warp is closed," she murmured. "The choir is empty." Her words drifted like smoke, fragile and weightless, until they too dissolved in the stillness. Cord stepped to the edge of the rampart. Below lay the wreckage of the last stand, shattered barricades, twisted weapons, and the pale shapes of the fallen, already shrouded in a thin mist that crept from the gelled sea. The green glow of the Hive Fleet pulsed faintly on the horizon, but no movement stirred. The predators had withdrawn, leaving only their work behind, a world remade, its life reduced to silent feeding. A breeze brushed his cheek, damp and heavy with the metallic tang of the alien harvest. It carried no sound of engines, no cries of pursuit. Even the swarm's vast breathing seemed to have ceased, as if the planet itself had been drawn into a deeper sleep. Cord felt the weight of the quiet settle over his chest, pressing like the memory of a dream already fading. Vera rose slowly, her robes brushing the scorched stone. "It is done," she said. "We have been remembered in the way the void remembers." Her voice was neither mournful nor defiant, merely certain, as if the universe itself had spoken through her lips. The sky above remained a dull, living green, but it no longer moved. The capillary towers stood motionless, their harvest complete. Across the dead seas the light flickered once, twice, then steadied, a faint pulse in an endless dark. Cord closed his eyes and listened to the silence. It was not peace. It was not even absent. It was the sound of everything that had ever been swallowed whole and left behind, a hush so profound it seemed the galaxy itself held its breath. The hive mind's arrival was not marked by sight or sound, but by a pressure that seeped into every living thought, Lieutenant. Arlen Cord felt it first, as a weight behind the eyes, a subtle tightening of the skull, as though the bones themselves strained to contain something vast. The ruined bastion around him lay shrouded in the stagnant green glow of the Hive Fleet's harvest, yet the silence that had followed the slaughter no longer felt empty. It was full of intelligence that needed no words, the sensation built like a rising tide. It was not a voice, yet it carried the inevitability of speech, a chorus without beginning or end, whispering in perfect unison. Every memory Cord had ever claimed as his own, the creak of the outpost's decks, the laughter of his crew, the scent of rain on his homeworld flickered as if lit by a failing lumen. Each recollection wavered beneath a pressure that sought not to erase but to subsume, to fold every spark of individuality into a single, boundless will. Astropath Vera clutched the blackened remnant of her staff. Her blind eyes widened, pupils clouded in milky terror.
"It reaches," she breathed, her voice thin and shaking.
Not with words, with knowing. Her knees buckled as she pressed her palms to her temples. It is everywhere at once. Cord tried to speak and found his own thoughts crowding with alien impressions. The taste of copper-rich oceans turned to nutrient gel, the rhythmic pulse of capillary towers drinking the planet dry, the cold satisfaction of a hunger that would never be sated. He could feel the motion of distant bioships as if their colossal bodies were his own limbs, sense the frictionless glide of spores through the air. even the minute tremors of countless talons burrowing into the planet's crust. A terror older than fear gripped him. The hive mind did not simply surround the world it occupied. The air itself seemed woven with its will, every breath an unspoken command to surrender. His own heartbeat stumbled, trying to match the deeper rhythm that thrummed through the ground. The pulse of a living galaxy, steady and inexorable. Around him, the few remaining survivors clutched their heads or collapsed in silent agony. Some wept without tears, their minds caught in the flood of alien communion.
A child whimpered, her small hands clawing at the air as if to scrape away the invisible net. Vera raised her face, her voice a hoarse whisper.
It does not hate.
It does not love.
It only is. The pressure deepened until Cord could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and the swarm began. He sensed the immensity of a consciousness that spanned light years, a vast predatory calm that regarded all life as nothing more than fuel. In that final moment of clarity, before his sense of self blurred into the endless hunger, Cord understood the true nature of the hive mind, not a presence to be fought or fled, but an ocean of will in which every living soul would eventually drown. The Tyranids did not simply conquer the planet, they digested it. From the shattered cliffs to the gelled seas, every surface now crawled with the slow, methodical industry of living machines. Capillary towers, once pale and slender, had thickened into monstrous trunks of chitin and muscle. They pulsed with a steady rhythm, drawing the planet's essence upward like the veins of a vast alien heart. Each beat sent tremors through the ground, a reminder that the world itself was being pumped dry. Forests already blackened by sporefall sagged into slick heaps of rot. Tyranid feeder organisms, many little more than mouths on limbs, oozed across the softening soil. Their mandibles worked ceaselessly, tearing leaves, bark, and stone into pulpy paste.
Acid dripped from their jaws, hissing as it melted not only plant and animal, but the very minerals beneath.
The land exhaled a heavy scent of copper and fermentation, a humid reek that clung to skin and memory alike. The dead were not spared. Human and animal remains alike vanished beneath blankets of rippling mycelial mats. These carpet-like growths crept with deliberate patience, releasing tendrils tipped with needle-like proboscises. Each touch dissolved flesh, bone, and armor into a nutrient slurry. Even weapons ladrifles, steel plating, the wreckage of tanks succumbed to the same patient hunger. Their metals broken down by enzymes and folded into the planet's dying crust. Above, the sky writhed with the labor of larger harvesters. Towering bioforms descended in slow gravitational arcs, their bellies opening like the maws of colossal leeches. They lowered translucent siphons that plunged deep into the Earth's molten core, drawing up mineral-rich slurry to feed the waiting hive ships. Around them, the air shimmered with a mist of alien spores, each one a microscopic laborer aiding in the final dismantling of the world. Lieutenant Arlen Cord watched from the ruins of the bastion, his eyes hollow. The ground beneath his boots throbbed as if the planet's own heartbeat had been replaced by that of the swarm. Where oceans once lay, only luminous gel now pulsed. Where mountains had stood, ridges of flesh and chitin rose like the ribs of some awakening beast. Astropath Vera's voice came soft and certain. "It leaves nothing wasted," she said, "not even memory." All around them the world surrendered without sound. Life, stone, metal, every substance was claimed, broken into its smallest parts, and drawn upward toward the waiting hive ships. In the end, the planet was no longer a place but a harvest, a single meal for a hunger that would never end. When the Tyranids were done, The planet no longer had a name from orbit.
No trace of ocean or mountain broke the surface.
Only a dull expanse the colour of old bone, pocked with the faint, symmetrical scars where capillary towers had once risen. The hive ships, swollen with their harvest, had already withdrawn into the endless dark. Their departure left behind neither smoke nor echo, only a world that no longer breathed. Lieutenant Arlen Cord stood on a ridge of what had once been stone and felt nothing beneath his boots but a dry, fibrous crust. It crumbled at the slightest pressure, releasing a whisper of dust too fine to be called soil. The air lay heavy and still. No wind stirred the grey horizon. Even the sky, once alive with spores and the living flesh of the fleet, now hung blank and empty, a pale echo of the void. Astropath Vera moved beside him, her steps soundless. Her sightless eyes turned toward the heavens where the hive had vanished. "They have taken even the noise," she said, her voice soft enough that it barely reached his ear. Not death, Cord listened. He heard the faint rasp of his own breath and the soft creak of the crust beneath his weight. Nothing else. No bird call or distant surf, no hum of hidden machinery, not even the subtle vibrations of a living planet. The silence was complete, and in it he felt the unsettling certainty that the world itself had forgotten it had ever lived. He crouched and let the pale dust sift through his fingers. It carried no scent, no warmth. The particles clung briefly to his skin, then drifted away in breathless air like the ashes of a fire that had burned without witness. He thought of the oceans turning to gel, the forests dissolved into slurry, the countless lives consumed until their stories meant no more than minerals in a vein of ore. All of it gone, and the stars beyond indifferent. Vera lowered her head.
This is what remains when hunger finishes its prayer. The words lingered in the stillness like the last ripple of a stone cast into a bottomless well.
Around them stretched a landscape stripped not only of life but of memory, a silence so deep it felt eternal. Cord closed his eyes, and for a moment the emptiness pressed inward like a second skin. There was no triumph in the void, no lament, only the quiet where life had been, and the endless night waiting to claim the next world.